Hey, good afternoon. Welcome everyone to the Irregular Warfare Initiative's inaugural event on Proxies and Partners. We are super delighted today to have two of the best, one a practitioner and one a scholar that both study proxies and partners at length. So first, General Joseph Votel, as everyone will recognize, is a retired U.S. Army four-star and most recently the commander of U.S. Central Command before SOCOM and Joint Special Operations Command before that. He was responsible, most importantly, for the campaign to defeat the ISIS caliphate in Iraq and Syria from 2015 to 2019. He currently serves as the chair for the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point and is also a distinguished fellow at the Middle East Institute, among other things that he does. Dr. Vladimir Rauta is an associate professor of international security at the University of Reading and the director of this project, the Proxies and Partners Special Project for IWI. He researches conflict delegation to proxies. His latest publications are an article in the International Security and Rutledge Handbook of Proxy Wars. As everyone's tracking irregular warfare, the initiative really seeks to bridge the gap between practitioners, policymakers, and scholars on the really, really important topic right now of irregular warfare. So without further ado, we are going to kind of start off with a little bit of a softball question to General Votel to just talk to us about terrorism. And most importantly, what worries you right now? And since your time in uniform, how has the threat of terrorism changed? And how can the U.S. and its allies be prepared for any emerging threats?
Yeah, thanks, Katie. And Vlad, it's good to be on with you as well. And really applaud your efforts here through the IWI and to focus on this particular area. It's a really critical and important one for us going forward here. So I think it's a great question. And, so I think one of the things to think about in answering that in terms of what's changed is let's talk about what's not changed. And what hasn't changed is that the political aspect of terrorism has not changed. It's still largely motivated for political purposes. Terrorist organizations are focused on exploiting vulnerabilities in our own systems. That's not changed. We've seen that recently. There are a couple nuances within this. One of the things I think that the broader counterterrorism community is paying attention to right now, and this is kind of the blending of migration and terrorism. We certainly saw some of that in the Moscow attack here recently, and of course we've got our own concerns on our southwest border with respect to that. So those things are kind of staying the same with this. But what is changing, I think, is the level of violence. It's interesting to me. Having worked against ISIS, how violent that organization was. It was almost as if Hamas was trying to outdo them in just some of the atrocious behavior and activities that they perpetrated, particularly back on October 7th. And so, I think we do continue to see an increasing amount of violence and a recognition that the atrociousness of the violence really meets their political objectives. I think we're seeing some accelerators out there for radicalization that we have to pay attention to. Certainly the internet and the continued use of advanced technology in this could all be accelerators to radicalization. Of course, all that has an implications on terrorism as well. I think we see some commingling of purposes here for why people are getting involved in this. And I think what we're seeing when you look across the scope of terrorist organizations globally is organizations coming together who have different objectives, but they share in the idea of kind of cooperating with each other to gain the biggest impact. So I think that is a change that we're seeing here. Those are some of the things that kind of stick out for me. To the second part of your question, Katie, and I don't want to run on too long here, but obviously we have to think about our strategies about how we deal with this. I would suggest I'm retired, so I can say this. I'm concerned about whether we put enough focus on the enduring threat of strategy in our national defense security. Security strategy. Certainly appreciate our pacing threat of China and other things like this, but we have to make sure that our plans and policies really address this, and that we do dedicate the resources to this. It can't always be a pickup reaction game in terms of the threat of terrorism. So we've got to do that. We've got to stay focused on that. We've got to look at cooperation and what that means, not just within our own government, but with our international partners. Interestingly, as I was mentioning a little before we got started here, a recent conference that I was part of in the UK. We talked about some of these aspects. We talked about the importance of common appraisal systems. We talked about the importance of common assessment systems for terrorist organizations. We talked about the importance of tipping and queuing, and we talked about the importance of being able to look at this at scale and with speed, because there are these accelerators, these technology accelerators that are out there that are really moving these organizations around quite a bit. And then I think we also have to make sure we stay focused on the underlying causes. We can't underestimate the impact of underlying causes that give rise to radicalization, that leads to terrorism, and everything that comes with this. Most importantly, I would just say we have to appreciate the cost of a terrorist incident. I mean, if you go back and look at 9/11, for example, or look at what's happened most recently here in Israel and Gaza, what's the cost of that, and that nations and governments bear as a result of not being prepared and not being focused on that. And we have to look at it through those kinds of lens right there to make sure that we take the proper preventive measures up front and not just be reactive to it.
Thanks so much, sir. You talked about how addressing terrorism, it can't always be a pickup game. We can't always treat this as a crisis, and it is, after all, an enduring threat. So kind of segueing into what we're talking about today with proxies and partnerships. I know that when we were at CENTCOM, you put relationships as your primary focus. And so just as we can't have a pickup game with regards to the adversary, we cannot have a pickup game with regards to our proxies, our partnerships, our friendly forces. Can you talk a little bit about the emphasis that you placed on that in your last few command tours, and why you think that could have set us up for a successful campaign against ISIS?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question, and it was an important aspect of my work, particularly as a CENTCOM commander. And I think, as you and I have talked about in the past, I would say about 70% of my time was really spent on relationships and building, strengthening, deepening, thickening relationships, whether those were with our partners or with others that were in kind of the ecosystem that we had to depend upon for this. But I think this is I think a pretty critical senior leader task in terms of this, and I think it's important for people to appreciate that not only is it important for leaders to have relationships, but you've got to encourage thick relationships, meaning that your subordinates also bring relationships into this and work the same thing. One of the real success stories with the Syrian Democratic Forces was that we had multiple leaders who had developed relationships, not just with General Mazloum, who was the commander, but with a number of his subordinates and subordinate commanders. And that really provided us a lot of resilience in the relationship. So when things did go wrong, when we worked through rough spots, we really had very good, thick, and deep relationships that we could work with this. I think it's important to, as you step into relationships, to appreciate the listen, understand, respond approach, if you will. That is, listen to what people are telling you, try to understand what they're conveying to you, and before you start responding. And then when you do respond, be responsive. Our partners can handle yeses and nos very easily. What becomes frustrating is when we give them what I've always referred to as the indefinite maybe. We might do this for you. We might do that for you. That, to me, is a relationship killer, and it undermines trust and confidence in the relationships. And then finally, I think the thing you have to think about in relationships is that not every relationship is going to be a positive one. You're going to have to work through difficult relationships and develop those as well, and find common ground. Find where the nexus is between organizations that have competing or differing, systems that under which they operate here, but yet are mutually dependent upon each other. And from my perspective, that was really important. I think those things are really why I spent so much time on relationship building.
Perfect. Hey, Vladimir, maybe over to you just to talk about, General Votel talked about the practitioner side of building relationships, but do you want to get a little bit into theory and the principal agent relationships that you've written so much about recently?
I mean, I could if I spent a fair amount of time thinking about it, but I think they're sort of useful for the theoretical / scholarly debate on this, and it helps us sort of understand some of the problems. I think they're sort of they have a specific sort of utility, but there are also some limitations that sort of come with this, and perhaps the reality of sort of partnerships on the ground or proxy warfare is not sort of accurately captured by this. And so I wanted to sort of to quickly piggyback on what General Votel was sort of talking about in terms of the relevance of sort of relationships, because it is essentially where the entire debate currently is. It is no longer just about understanding what one state might do with one sort of actor, but how these actually sit in broader configurations of actors, how sort of allies come together to sort of build up a partner, how sort of adversaries cooperate in sort of transferring weapons to a proxy. So I think it is quite a unique point in time to sort of see that both the scholarly interest in the topic somehow matches what sort of happens on the ground, and this speaks to sort of where the project is coming from, the sort of the partners and proxies special projects with the Irregular Warfare Initiative, but also allows us to ask very, very specific questions that are relevant for us as sort of trying to shape the academic debate, but also to speak to key questions that practitioners are asking. And I wanted to sort of go back to General Votel and sort of ask a very specific question in terms of the Syrian Democratic Forces. I think obviously you spoke so much about how to build it, but then also that some relationships are not sort of that they don't stay the same, right? So I think a lot of what we discuss in the academic debate is sort of what are some of the problems and where do these relationships break. So I think I was wondering whether you could speak about a bit about the challenges that the partnership posed and how you sort of overcame them.
Yeah, sure. It's really it's a really important topic. I think there are a couple of things that really worked in our favor. And we're talking about the Syrian Democratic Forces, so let me just talk on that. That were in our favor. First and foremost was the issue of urgency. I mean, there was an urgent situation with them, as our listeners will remember, back in the late 2014, early 2015 timeframe, the Kurdish component of the Syrian Democratic Forces literally had their backs against the wall, against the Turkish Syrian border, and they were nearly wiped out in the town of Kobani. So there was a real significant urgency that fed into this. And then secondly, there was an important alignment that took place between us and them in terms of we had looked far and wide across Syria for partners who might help us with the ISIS campaign. And as you'll remember, we had some abortive efforts with some Sunni militia organizations that we found there that did not pan out. And the reason was because we couldn't get alignment with them in terms of what the mission was. That was not a big problem with the Kurds, who later turned into the Syrian Democratic Forces, because they were clearly focused on the threat of ISIS. So these things were really, really, really critical to establish up front and to preserve throughout all of this. I think we did a number of other things well from this. I mean, our political leadership, I think, really helped us focus in on a very specific mission that we did not deviate from in terms of this. We really stayed on the enabling aspect of the relationship, meaning we didn't try to reorganize them in our own design or in our own image with this. The Syrian Democratic Forces, the YPG, the Kurdish portion of that came with a hierarchical structure in place with some pretty good leaders, frankly, and experienced leaders. So we didn't try to get in and muck around in that and change it. We just tried to enable it as much as we could, and we knew we had to work through some difficult things in this. And myself and General Mazloum and my subordinate commanders and Mazloum and some of the, I mean, we had a lot of very difficult discussions here. One of the most difficult was how we would deal with the concern of Turkey. Our NATO ally Turkey was not in favor of this. And as you'll remember, there were several incursions that came across the border because of perceived threats by the Turks in this. And we had to, this was a potential obstacle to the relationship. And so we had to work through that, and we had to make it very clear what we would and what we would not do with the Syrian Democratic Forces. And so there were a number of very difficult discussions that had to take place. But because of the investment in relationships and because of the level of trust that we had developed over time, and that was thick and resilient, we were able to navigate those things.
Yeah. I mean, if I can just quickly jump in, Katie, you asked me earlier how can we apply sort of concepts that pertain to sort of principal agent. What struck me in General Votel's answer just now was sort of the language that was used: alignment and sort of political objectives and divergence of interest. This is precisely what sort of the theory says and how we think about it in our way, in how we formulate our research puzzles. So there is, in a way, sort of quite a bit of overlap in terms of how we think and the problems that we address in that sense. And research tells us quite a bit that sort of divergence of interest and mitigating that through sort of being quite clear about each side's political objectives is key here. And on ISIS, obviously, in terms of countering ISIS, key has been, and sort of I guess in terms of whatever a terrorist group might be countered in the future, key has been sort of the mobilization of international community. And in your experience, what does that mean in practice, and where do you think more work is needed?
Yeah, no, that's an important one. If I could, again, I know we kind of keep going back to things you said there, but you said some really important things there on the linkage to the political aspect. And I think one of the important things to appreciate in that, again, this was a vital key to success, was the fact that in addition to the military relationships that we had with the Syrian Democratic Forces, we actually had a political relationship as well. We had a special envoy, Mr. McGurk, who now serves up on the National Security Council for our current president, was the envoy. We had several diplomats, Ambassador Jeffries, a variety of others that operated in the area. We had a contingent of U.S. aid on the ground who worked with us. These were all critical components to the overall relationship, and actually, helped us make the bridge to something more longer term and more towards a political end state, which was, I think, really critical to that. And now I just forgot what the question is that you asked me and you wanted me to respond.
I was talking about the role of sort of the international community and
how it's
mobilized in support of sort of the partnership.
Yeah, this was critical as well. And again, this started. Again, we're talking about the Defeat ISIS campaign here, but I think you can look at it in a number of different examples. This started with a very significant effort on the political diplomatic front to bring people together. I mentioned the envoy, Mr. McGurk, General Allen before him. They were very critical, along with the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense, to basically bringing countries into the coalition and getting them aligned and on board. And that became very critical. And so early on in the conflict, I would say the center of gravity really was about building and empowering that coalition. And while the military played an important role in that, really the main effort was really with our diplomats and with our with kind of our ministerial cabinet level leadership, particularly in the form of the Secretary of Defense, who was absolutely essential. The Secretary Carter was really important as we pulled these together, pulled the coalition together, and of course the the subsequent secretaries of defense played a critical role, and the president came in a number of times. So it was really important to bring people in and get them aligned around this. What was equally important, and this did fall a little bit more into the military realm, was what I would describe, a concept that I would describe as coalition compliant planning. And that was the idea of bringing coalition military leaders into the planning, the assessing, the direction of the campaign, and making sure that over time we had a way of, we didn't just ask them once, what do you think about this? But we kept coming back to it. We kept revisiting it. I can remember that we brought really the leaders of the 12 or 13 main countries that were providing the military wherewithal on the ground to Tampa, and we would routinely do that about quarterly, a couple times a year, to review the campaign and make decisions about moving to the next phase or the next sub phase of the operation. So they were involved in it. So there's a political component to it, there's a military component to it, but what was really successful to this was that in both of those realms, it was repetitive, it was sustained, it was deep, and there was real involvement by the coalition members in the overall campaign.
Great. Just to go back, sir, just to a little bit of the military aspect, and you had begun talking about General Mazloum, who was the head of the Syrian Democratic Forces at the time. How do you think that you were able to strike a balance between, you referred to kind of letting them have their own command relationships and their own doctrine, if you will, both kind of operationally and tactically. How did you really strike this balance, though? We used to call it by, with, and through, of giving them just enough rope to kind of go out on their own and accomplish the missions without asserting too much control. And why do you think that you were really successful in that? And in turn, why were they so successful?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I think we had, first of all, we had people with them all the time. I mean, that was important. And I don't want to overemphasize my role in this, because I was a little bit of a helicopter guy in this, where I would kind of come in and do my thing and then kind of come out of the situation, and then relied on some really great leaders and troops on the ground who really did the emphasis of that. But I think there's a couple things here I think that were successful. Early on, I think we were able to demonstrate the value of our enablement to them and what that meant to them. I mean, we talked about the urgency, but back in Kobani, in the very dark days of 2015 there, when things were not looking good for the YPG, or not looking good in northeast Syria for anybody but ISIS, we had to demonstrate that we could be value added to them with our ISR and eventually with some of the munitions that we were able to kind of bring in on their behalf. And that really, and we were able to sustain that over time. So demonstrating the ability to be useful to them in the accomplishment of their objectives is important. The second thing is that we did have a plan in terms of how we were going to do things on the ground, and there was rigorous debate about the sequence of activities in terms of this, so we went to Raqqa, for example. We were very keen. Our political leadership was very keen on getting to Raqqa, taking care of that, because we knew that this was the center hub of ISIS in Syria, and that removing that would be a significant blow to them. But the fact of the matter is, you can't just go to Raqqa. You had to do a lot of things to kind of set that up in terms of it, and all that had to be kind of worked with the Syrian Democratic Forces in a sequence that they could handle and they could execute, and throughout all of this, along the way we had to work through a variety of issues. The security forces left behind, the institution of local political leadership on the ground, if you will, councils, if you will, that came in and you took over clear ground. We had to have some alignment behind that. In terms of the execution of the campaign, I mean, we did defer a lot to them in how it got executed. Katie, you'll remember in the closing months of the campaign, we had a number of what I would describe as kind of fits and starts going down the Euphrates Valley as they came to villages and areas like that. They wanted to talk to the tribal leaders. They wanted to stop. They wanted to allow ISIS to get out of there, so they minimized the impact on these Arab communities in there. This was a difficult thing for our political leadership to get their head around, but we had to work through that. So we had to acknowledge their expertise on the ground and their knowledge of the area in which we were operating, and really allow that to have some primacy, while at the same time looking at how we could bring our capabilities to best enable them.
Awesome. Vlad?
I know I was going to sort of ask a follow-up question in the sense that as far as I sort of the buy with through model somehow sort of maps on previous sort of engagement from Afghanistan to sort of Iraq and sort of the insurgency there, and of course it sort of takes a totally different shape in Syria, or with the Syria mission. What do you think it is its legacy in terms of as a sort of what does it as a sort of an operational approach?
I mean, in my view, the kind of the by, with, and through approach that we ended up taking in Syria really, I think, reflected the high maturation of our by, with, and through concepts here. We'd certainly had a lot of experience with this. Not all of it bad, but not all of it good, in both Afghanistan and Iraq, and a variety of other places where we, weren't quite as, the scale wasn't quite as big, but we had a number of counterterrorism efforts that were ongoing in countries across the region, the Middle East, North Africa, and even into the Horn of Africa area here that we were focused on. But I really think what we were able to do in Syria really, I think, represented the high order maturation of what we were doing there, and I think it is a good model for us to look at in the future. I think one of the things people sometimes talk about is, does this have application to our other security concerns? Think about the Pacific, think about our challenges out there. Is there application? And I guess my answer is, yeah, there absolutely is. We are incapable of doing everything. We have to rely on partners. Some of our partners are going to be better prepared for the missions they find themselves in than others are, and some of them we will have to enable. And so, figuring out ways of doing that and mechanisms for doing this, I think, are going to be, really, really critical for us as we move forward. It's not a panacea. There are going to be some challenges along with it, and maybe we can talk about some of the challenges of all of this in a moment here. But I think the legacy is that it took us 14, 15 years, but we kind of figured it out. And I'm not suggesting things we were doing before were wrong or right, but I just think that the example that we had, or the opportunity that we had in Syria and in Iraq, really allowed us to mature that concept. And I think it is kind of burned into our DNA, so to speak, as a model that we can apply in other situations as well.
Great. So before we move on from Syria, and speaking of exciting times in Syria, I just want to take a few minutes to talk about the Wagner Group and Russia's use of, the paramilitary and the private military corporations that they were using then. I know we had a couple exciting years there in 2017, 18, dealing with the Wagner Group in Syria. So if you could talk just a little bit about, how you viewed them, but more importantly, how you think that they've evolved since then, from 2018 to now, and especially their use across Africa and what they're doing in Ukraine, even if they're not called Wagner anymore, just kind of how they've learned from their own operations in Syria, and perhaps learning from our by, with, and through, and kind of how you see that trajectory.
Yeah, well, my attention to the Wagner Group, like everyone, like most everyone's attention to the Wagner, really began to be more substantial in the 2014 timeframe when Russia went into Crimea and kind of the first incursions into Ukrainian sovereign territory, and we saw the so-called little green men and other things like this, and so we began to appreciate that Russia had a very sophisticated irregular warfare approach here. And in fact, I can remember the discussion in SOCOM, and I was a SOCOM commander around right after all that happened. Russia was schooling us on how to do this, frankly, and I think demonstrate a fairly high level order of how to conduct irregular warfare in a situation like that. Certainly not supporting the objectives they were after, but really significant with that. And then of course, through our experience in Syria, we saw Wagner in a number of ways. A lot of their efforts are really focused over in the western spine of the country. But as you noted, in early 2018, we did, as we were gaining more momentum and more success in our campaign in the north and eastern part of the country, that drew their interest. It drew the interest of the Syrian regime. It drew the interest of the Iranians, a variety of militia groups. And so we saw Wagner come over here and actually be this coalescing leadership element that brought people together. Of course, we had a pretty significant smackdown with them there in February of 2018. That worked out pretty well for us, not so well for them in terms of what they're doing. But I think what concerns me about Wagner today is that they are as you look to places like North Africa and the Sahel, the Maghreb, and some of these other places where we find them, they have become, they are being viewed as a legitimate security alternative for these countries. I think we're all paying close attention to what's happening in Niger right now, where the United States forces have largely been asked to leave. French forces that have been pretty prominent in the area have largely departed from the area, and they're being replaced by Wagner organizations on the ground. And so they have become much more integrated into the Russian approach to their security operations. They have this probably has only increased since the death of Prigozhin, their first leader. I think that's probably sent a chilling effect to the other leaders that came in behind them, and so they're much more integrated into this. They're more strategic. They're more broadly deployed. They're increasing their capabilities to bring more mercenaries and proxies along with them. So I think it's really concerning, I think, in terms of this what this organization does here, and I think it is unfortunately setting an example that other autocratic regimes are going to look to replicate. When we had the kind of the big smackdown there in February of 2018 with them, one of the things we took out of that was that we recognized that there were actually two Russian chains of command in Syria. We had the military one, and then we had the Wagner one. I think those are coming closer and closer together now, and that to me is really, really concerning as we go forward and they continue to exercise their adventuresome activities in a variety of locations.
Yeah, if I can just sort of really quickly jump in, I wholeheartedly agree with what General Votel talked about. I think we run the risk of underestimating the degree to which Wagner or whatever its current name is actually is for Russia. It is a clear instrument of power. I think we run the risk of sort of like thinking that this is some sort of disposable proxy when it's clearly not. The way it is sort of set up and where it's coming from, and as an offshoot of sort of so many failed processes of transformation of military and revolution of military affairs in Russia, and sort of layers of failed privatization of things. It's really not your typical proxy. We can call it like that, but we have to treat it for what it is, as an instrument of the Russian state that is very clearly sort of let loose in corners of the world where Russia has not been present for such a long time, right? And it does sort of bring the element of deniability and sort of the delegation aspect, but we shouldn't just think of it as a sort of as an entity that is somehow divorced from the Kremlin.
Yeah, absolutely.
While we're talking about the big countries, the big bad ones, China and Russia, General Votel, could you talk a little bit about the potential application of by, with, and through just on the more conventional battlefields, and what lessons that we can be learning from, how we dealt with proxies and partners, just apply that to kind of our bigger allies in the Indo-Pacific and in Europe?
Yeah, no, that's an important area as well. I mean, I think, again, from my perspective, and I don't want to be repetitive here, but I really think the most important thing is when we start working with partners and with proxies and others out there is really this alignment that we try to achieve. And this, to me, this is, I think, the most important governing factor in the success of these programs, is making sure that we are well aligned with our partners, with our proxies, with whoever is that we are enabling to do our bidding or is doing their own bidding, and we support that bidding kind of stuff, is to make sure that we are well aligned with them in terms of what the overall objective is. Again, this was the key to success in Syria with the Syrian Democratic Forces. And I think we did a good job. I actually think we did a very good job with the Iraqi defense forces as well, after they were kind of reconstituted, rebuilt in the wake of the very difficult days of 2014, 2015, when they all collapsed up around Mosul. And what had been a pretty venerable force was rendered pretty weak at one particular point. But getting aligned around what we were going to do, what the focus of this was, how we were going to approach it, I think is really, really critical. I think we always have to make deliberate decisions about trying to get into the guts of institution building and stuff like that. There are some instances where we probably can help with that, and with some nations we can do that. There are others where I don't think it doesn't serve our particular purposes well. And I think in the campaign against ISIS, you saw a couple different examples here. We were never going to do anything like that with the Syrian Democratic Forces, but yet we are strengthening the institutions of the Iraqi military, and we remain there doing that kind of stuff. So that's pretty important. The decision to embed teams and leaders and elements with our partners, I think, is an important one. Thinking through that, largely as a result of our experience in Syria, the Army, the U.S. Army has developed our security force assistance brigades that are really tailor-made for these type of operations, and working with partners and developing their capacity and enabling them. To me, this again is a further maturation of the overall approach here to what we're doing. But I definitely think we can, this is important out in the Indo-Pacific. There are going to be partners that they're going to have to, take responsibility in the areas. They're going to need a little bit of assistance from us in terms of doing that. And we're going to have to find a way to do that. So I think the concept still applies to those situations as well.
I mean, I think there's also another side, if we sort of flip the coin here and think about sort of how sort of great power competition is sort of triggered, or how we see it, at least in terms of Russia, we can think of sort of its own approach of sort of sponsoring proxies and all that as a form of sort of escalation and escalation dominance. And I think Ukraine here is a very clear example of where sort of what starts in 2014 and in sort of the south east of Ukraine, sort of with proxies, and then they themselves sort of step in all the way to gradually invading Ukraine conventionally. So I think there is quite a clear link between sort of the use of proxies and sort of the conventional side of great power competition, and it's been obvious and regrettably so since 2022 with Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah. If I could just jump one on this idea of by, with, and through, and thinking about all of this, and I kind of alluded to it a little bit ago, but I do think it's important to recognize that there are some potential friction points in all of this that you really have to pay attention to, as well. I mentioned one of them, and it's it's the expectations within the political community for this. During the campaign against ISIS, there were certain expectations that the Secretary of Defense, the administration here had in terms of the campaign and how it was going to be executed. And of course, when you're in an enablement role and somebody else is actually putting their forces at risk to do this, there are going to be some changes. So you do have to think about how you manage expectations from this. Oftentimes, with partner forces, with proxies that are operating for you, they are going to set the pace. They are going to have an aspect of informing the priorities, and they are going to employ the methods that work best for them. And that doesn't mean we should automatically accept all of those. Certainly, we have a responsibility here to operate in accordance with the law of armed conflict, and an ethical, values-based way in terms of this. But these are all things that we have to be paying attention to as we confront this idea of by, with, and through going forward. It isn't just automatic. It isn't just you shake hands, your partners, and then everything is great. This takes work all the way through with this, and that work has to go up and down the chain of command.
Yeah, if I can just pull on that thread a little bit, sir. So you talked about the importance of alignment with our partners, but within our own government, I know you spend a lot of time speaking to the interagency, and earlier you referred to our partnerships with the State Department and USAID and various ambassadors throughout Iraq, Syria, Jordan that were helping us at the time. Now in the conflict with Ukraine, I think that we've seen kind of this evolution or transition to partnerships with commercial entities too, right? I mean, we have things going on with Starlink and Palantir in Ukraine and things like that. How do you see in the future, how to start incorporating bits of the defense industrial base, not so much from kind of the munitions aspect, but the actual relationships and just, the technology and ideas that they can bring to bear, and how do we start to use those partnerships as we kind of round out what we can't do, since we can't be all things to all people?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I'm not sure I've got a great answer for you in terms of this. I mean, I think first and foremost, one of the things we have to do as military leaders, the profession really has to become much smarter on how on advancing technologies and on how these organizations work and operate best in terms of doing it. And most of these, when you look at most of the capabilities that are really, bringing things to bear and making a difference on the ground in Ukraine today, that largely come out of our innovation base. These are not necessarily capabilities or systems or companies that are designed to be optimized within the current acquisition procurement process that we have. So we have to figure out ways to understand what's out there, but then try to leverage it and then try to enable it as much as we can in the systems. And I think that is really the big challenge of it. I think it starts with education of military leaders and with people in industry as well. Really critical to develop that as we move forward, I think. So I don't know. I think it's a great question. I'm not doing a great job answering it, but I think it's definitely something we ought to be focused on here. And there's got to be an organizational approach that we can take to this, I think.
Yeah, I think it's something that we're definitely kind of struggling with in the community right now. How do we leverage these companies in a quick and efficient manner on the battlefield? Kind of along those same lines, if I just ask one more question. When you were working with the interagency, what about entities like the Coast Guard or law enforcement and kind of the unique capabilities that they can bring to bear because they have further reach, across jurisdictions, if you will? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the Coast Guard and the law enforcement, federal law enforcement entities in our country. I mean, these are extraordinary capabilities right here. I think it's important to appreciate, particularly if we're talking about terrorism out here, is that the majority of partners that we have around the world, particularly those in Europe and in other places, this is looked at through a law enforcement lens and not necessarily a military lens. And so being able to enable them, I think, is really important. I think one of the things I was very proud of during my time at really started at JSOC and then SOCOM and then at CENTCOM was the establishment of Gallant Phoenix, for example. So if you think about the challenge we had with foreign fighters back in the day there with ISIS, where tens of thousands of them coming from 100 different countries around the world, flooding in through a system really enabled by social media to come and fight for ISIS. And trying to understand that was really, really critical. I mean, we kind of picked up on that because we had good cues from the intelligence community and our own military intelligence community, much less the broader IC here. But what we recognized was that we had to bring other partners into that very, very quickly. So not only did we bring other militaries into this, but under the guise of Gallant Phoenix, we brought a number of law enforcement organizations, both U.S. and international organizations, and the intelligence community into it. So, I think one of the things the military does really well, and we've learned this really well over the last 2.5 decades, is this idea of creating fusion cells, of creating platforms around which you can bring partners into and help enable their operations and make them part of it. That's what the Gallant Phoenix does. That's what fusion cells do. That's what joint interagency task forces, combined joint interagency task forces do for that. These organizations are very unique, but they have to. But when they're well established, when they're supported by leaders, they really have the ability to be cooperation, collaboration accelerators for our activities out there. So I'm thinking as a military guy here, and thinking about how you organize properly for the environment that you're in. And I think these types of platforms really, really pay off for us.
I mean, I've been thinking a bit about this in terms of the strategies to sort of counter proxies, and what strikes me is that sort of one has to approach it as a whole of government or thing, right? It's not that it's the military's responsibility. Of course, there are bits where the military has to sort of do its thing, but like there's other tools in the toolbox, in the toolkit that one can use. Think about sort of like the sponsoring proxies financially and how important that side is. You have law enforcement. Diplomacy is fundamental in trying again to get allies to sort of help you out in this. So I think your question, Katie, comes to sort of the importance of thinking about this whole problem as not just an interagency thing, but as a whole of government. Perhaps this is the European version of translating interagency. But I totally agree.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Let's move on to Iran if we can. And, in light of things that have happened since last October with Hamas and just the different pulls and pushes that we've seen both from our side and our partner in Israel and Iran's different proxies that they have in the region. So you just want to kind of walk us through your current thinking on the strength that Iran has over its proxies and what your fear or lack thereof fear is for them going forward with the hold that they have on their proxies.
Yeah, thanks. It's a topic I've really been thinking about a lot lately, and because my thinking is a little bit scattershot here, because I do oftentimes wonder if Iran has the level of control that we would ascribe to them. My gut feeling is they probably do, but I think one of the things that we're seeing in this network is that the so-called axis of resistance that Iran has established here is that there is a streak of independence with these actors in here in terms terms of the things that they can do. I think this is what we've seen with Hamas, for example. I'm not reading the intelligence. I'm not looking at anything particularly unique. I just know my own network and talking to people here. I think there's a case to be made that Iran was perhaps a little bit surprised by what Hamas did as well in terms of this, and I think that highlights that these actors within this network do retain some level of independence, some level of sovereignty, if you will, that they're going to act in their own interests, and when those interests align with Iran's, then that's even better. But they're gonna thrust into this. So I'm thinking a lot about that in terms of the level of control. I guess my working thesis here is that Iran does exercise a significant amount of control over these organizations, if not ideologically through the arms and other things that they provide to these organizations, the political legitimacy that they provide to them. I think these are all really, really critical aspects of this, and so I think the threat network has changed a lot. I think I can, again, from my time in uniform, and I'm now 5 years, beyond my expiration date here. But if you look at the role of the Shia militia groups in Iraq, it's become much stronger. They've become much more well established. And by the way, these groups that are largely, in many cases, Iraqi citizens, with the support and at the behest of Iran, have actually pursued lawfare activities in Iraq to change things, to make it more favorable for them. So they have gone for that. None of that occurs, I think, without the enablement and strong support of Iran in this network, of course. And you've got down in the Red Sea, and now you've got a proxy of Iran that is having strategic impacts here in terms of free flow of commerce. I mean, largely the global shipping community has basically said, we got to find a workaround. We're going to go around Africa to get there, and there's now kind of normalized that. I mean, that's the impact of this network right here. That it's more than just a local, regional impact now. Now it's having some global implications, and how we handle that, how we address that, I think will be a really key test for us and for the international community, whether we allow that to stand or whether we try to reestablish some control over the so-called global commons here. I think this is going to be a real test for us.
Katie, I think you asked the $1 million question here, both in terms of what's happening in the region, but then also for our debate about sort of partners and proxies. And in fact, at West Point, I presented some ongoing work that I'm doing with my colleague Niklas Karlen from the Swedish Defense University on control in sort of proxy relations. My thinking on Iran is that it exercises different levels of control on different sort of on its different proxies. So I think one of the misconceptions is that perhaps it exercises the same degree. So I think that one thing that we should be careful about is to understand the variation here and how some relationships are more stable, longer, more durable than others, and as such control sort of ebbs and flows in that sense. But regardless of whether sort of assessing the degree of control, I think talking about control is super important because it is the source of miscalculation of Iran's intentions, of the proxy's own sort of intentions. And I think that translates into a miscalculations of our own political objectives or strategic objectives vis-a-vis Iran and its proxies. So I think control is where a lot of the focus in this debate sits, and in fact that there is no clear-cut answer as of yet.
Yeah, absolutely. General Votel, could you talk a little bit about something that some people call vicarious liability, and what that really means is kind of us getting in trouble for something that our partners do.
Well, I mean, are we kind of seeing an example of this right now with kind of our shipment of arms to Israel?
Mhm.
I mean, that's at a much broader strategic scale there. But I think in our system, this was a very important aspect of this. I mean, again, without getting into a whole lot of details here, we have and have had a number of programs where we enable partners out there, proxies, so-called proxies, who we have some alignment with, who share some values, who are conducting operations that support our strategic objectives. We have a responsibility that the conduct of those operations that they do with our support or with our enablement are conducted in a way that comports to international law and with the values that we hold dear. And I think this, to me, this is an important aspect of it. It really highlights the legitimacy of this particular approach right here. I think when you don't exercise something like that, that you're in a different realm, and it may be acceptable to us in some circumstances, and we have mechanisms I think, in our government to address that. But to me, this is a pretty important one. I'm also looking at the comments here by Matthew in the thing. I think these are really important things here, and I would agree that Wagner, for example, is no longer deniable by the Russian government. And so, we ought to be hammering on that, frankly. And that ought to be an aspect of it. And this has, I think, been the point with Iran all along here, is that, Iran can't just shrug their shoulders when the Houthis, hit a ship in the Red Sea or launch a bunch of missiles out in towards Israel or do something else like it. They can't shrug their shoulders. They have enabled all of that, and they have to be held accountable for that. And if we don't, then they get a pass on it. And to me, this is one of the most important things that we ought to be doing, not just the United States, but the international community, is holding Iran's feet to the fire, holding Russia's feet to the fire for the actions of their proxies and what they're doing out here. I mean, this whole thing in the Red Sea is it's maddening when they're ostensibly going after ships linked to the U.S. or Israel, but yet they're firing at everybody. I mean, it's had a significant impact on the delivery of international humanitarian aid to Sudan, for example. Almost cut it off. Who's being held accountable for that? I'll tell you who ought to be held accountable. Iran ought to be held accountable for that, because it's their proxy that's enabled that. So yeah, I'm sorry to get a little passionate here, but yeah, I think that's a big aspect of it. And it's the way that we have to conduct things as Americans, as Western democracies here, is that we do have to own responsibility for the actions of those that we enable, our partners, our proxies, however we want to characterize them.
Absolutely. And to effectively counter, what Iran is doing with its proxies, would you suggest or recommend going, you kind of referred to going after Iran or holding them accountable, or going for the proxies, going for the Houthis and the people that are actually kind of causing the damage within the Bab el-Mandeb and slowing down shipping, or holistically? Do we need to do it all?
Yeah, I mean, I get the discussion that's been going on here for a number of months here on whether we go downtown Tehran, or whether we go after a Shia militia group, or we go after the Houthis more broadly. There are clearly strategic implications to all of those things that have to be thought through very, very carefully. And I trust that we have the right people in our national security enterprise that can reach and assess. And to me, this gets down to risk in terms of what we're willing to accept. I think things changed for us, a couple months ago at Tower 22, when we saw the impact of a small UAV that can get in and can cause a lot of injuries and death to our soldiers. I know to me it's about the amount of risk that we're willing to accept here, and it's about making sure that when we define what it is we're willing to accept, that when there are instances that potentially push the risk up higher, that we have to respond more quickly. We can't be ambiguous about it. We have to be very, very clear. And this is where I am a little bit critical of our response to some of these things, whether it's been the Shia militia groups in Iraq and Syria, or whether it's been the Houthis, or whether it's been other things out here, folks that we've allowed some of this to. We've allowed them to push the red lines on this and try to establish new norms. And in each of those new norms comes with more accumulated risk and a higher level of risk that we're accepting here. So, how long are we going to do that? And we have to recognize that that's what this is. It's changing the risk calculus for us, and we have to be willing to take the actions necessary, whether that's against the proxies or against the supporter of the proxy.
Absolutely. All right. Well, our time is starting to come to an end, and we ended on my favorite topic of accumulated risk. So I think we've done it a lot of justice. Vlad, I know you wanted to say just a couple words about what you're doing with the Proxies and Partners project and what's coming up, and then we'll let General Votel make the last couple of words. So Vlad, over to you.
Thank you, Katie. I mean, basically, sort of the conversation touched on a lot of the themes that we want to explore as part of the special project, is to sort of understand how we sort of tackle older and newer challenges through partnerships and relationships as they sit on a spectrum, either sort of fully formalized and sort of alliances to sort of less so, and to understand how sort of the West does it in comparison to how others or our adversaries do it. I think that this is the mission of the special project. It fits with the broader mission of the Irregular Warfare Initiative of bringing sort of academics and practitioners and policymakers in this sort of constructive dialogue, much like we just sort of had now. And we welcome you to sort of engage with us, to follow what we're going to be doing, either in terms of sort of written content, sort of events like these, or sort of the super successful podcast that the Irregular Warfare Initiative hosts. Thank you.
General Votel, over to you for closing comments. And I'll just remind everyone before they go to please check out the Irregular Warfare Initiative website, which is superb, and the newsletters that are distributed. They're definitely educational.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks for moderating this. Vlad, thanks for the invitation and for being part of the discussion here. It's really been great. I really applaud this effort. I think this idea of the intellectual discourse behind this is really critical, and it's important for these discussions to take place. And I'm, just looking at the comments and the questions that came up in here, on whether it's about vicarious liability or what is about the inverse relationship between sanctions and proxy activity, which is a really interesting topic that we ought to maybe think a little bit more about. I actually think there may be something to that. I want to think a little bit more on, but it is this idea of intellectual discourse, I think, that is really, really critical to this, and that's the importance of organizations like IWI and others that are out there that are really promoting this discussion. So thanks for including me in this.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks so much. Happy Friday, everyone.